Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Welcome back to the All Me podcast. This is Don Hooten Jr., and today I'll be your host. It's been 15 years since the 2005 congressional hearings with Major League Baseball. Testing in Major League Baseball has become the strongest testing program in all of professional sports, and their education and outreach program on this topic are on the forefront of all professional sports. Today, you're going to hear from one of the guys who's in charge of Major League Baseball's drug testing programs. In this interview, we're going to talk with Jon Coyles, Vice President of Drug, Health, and Safety Programs at Major League Baseball. I've had the distinct opportunity to work with Jon for a number of years, and he's not only a guy I look up to and admire, but I'd also consider him one of my mentors. Jon is very passionate about the topic of anti-doping, and he's going to open the curtains in this discussion to give you a behind-the-scenes look into what drives him and the great work he's doing at MLB headquarters to keep their athletes safe. One of the things in this podcast you might learn is what a collective bargaining agreement is and how it's used when it comes to drug testing professional players. I've been asked many times over the years if it would be a good idea to institute a lifetime ban for those who cheat the game. So I posed this question to Jon in the interview, and he's got some great insight on the answers to that question. We want to thank our partners at Gatorade for sponsoring this episode. And don't forget to hit subscribe to this podcast, as we have a busy month of important interviews that we're going to be releasing. Let's bring Jon on the show and learn from what he has to say. Good morning, Jon, and welcome to the All Me podcast.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you bet, man. I'm really excited to talk to you today. I know the listeners are really going to enjoy learning more about you and the work that you're doing with Major League Baseball. So it's probably best for us to start talking about who you are, what gives you your drive and passion for anti-doping, and the important day-to-day work that you're doing. As a kid and young man, did you ever think to yourself that one day you'd work for one of the greatest sporting organizations in the world?
No, I've been doing this for a while, Don, and I still pinch myself every once in a while when you realize that you are working for Major League Baseball, working at the commissioner's office. Really is a great opportunity, and not a day goes by where I don't kind of appreciate where I am and the job I'm able to do.
I bet. I guess that's the sole definition of living the dream, right?
There you go. Absolutely.
So growing up, were you a baseball fan?
Yeah, very much so. I grew up in upstate New York. There is kind of representation of fans for all the New York City-based sports, which you do have your choice there, obviously. But in our household, baseball was the connection to not only my father, but both of my parents. My mom and dad were both big baseball fans, and it was just something that was a big part of kind of our household. We watched a lot of games, traveled down to the city to go to a bunch of games, and in addition to being proximate to both the Yankees and the Mets, we had a minor league affiliate in our hometown where I grew up, and probably most importantly from a fan perspective, we were just a short drive from Cooperstown, which if you ever want to promote being or trying to inspire someone to be a fan, just take them to the Baseball Hall of Fame, and that's something that'll happen pretty immediately.
That is on my bucket list. I've never been. My father's had the opportunity to go, but I've wanted to go since I was a little kid. And I'm sure you get this question all the time. Were you a Mets fan, a Yankees fan, or was there another team that you really enjoyed watching growing up?
Yeah. As of now, I will say that I am a fan of the sport of baseball and fan of all 30 Major League Baseball clubs equally. But growing up where I grew up and growing up in a household that had pretty strong fandom, we were a Yankees household growing up.
Okay. If people ask me that all the time, they're like, you're around baseball players all the time. You do a lot of work with Major League Baseball. Who's your favorite team? I was like, it's really hard because, as you know, you develop great relationships with people from all the teams, and everybody, they're wonderful, and they bring you in like family. And it's hard to say, well, I favor this one over that one. So I'm just a baseball fan in general.
Yeah, same here. It is interesting, given kind of the generation that I grew up in and where I grew up, there were actually, while it was a pretty even split, there are quite a bit of New York Mets fans just because of the success that they had in the mid-'80s. But yeah, our household was, more affiliated with the Yankees, even though we promoted or supported all New York-based teams. But it is interesting to your comment about kind of being a family or rooting for the good people that work for our clubs. Working at the commissioner's office, while this hasn't happened as frequently now as it did before, a lot of some of my very close friends and colleagues have worked at our office and then gone on to, work for a number of clubs, either in, a general manager position, assistant general manager position, or something within baseball operations. And, you want to see your friends and colleagues do well. So it's interesting working in baseball where, while you want to, ensure that people are doing well from just a professional standpoint, because they are affiliated with an organization, it's a good thing for them to have success on the field as well. So, you kind of pull for your friends and colleagues to, maintain their positions with the clubs and be successful in their own right, but also, see them proceed into the postseason, potentially even win a World Series from time to time.
Yes, very, very exciting. Now, growing up, were you an athlete? Did you play sports? And if so, what sports did you participate in?
I did grow up playing baseball. Grew up playing baseball from a young age, all the way up through college. But it became apparent pretty early on that I was better at running in a circle as opposed to hitting a curveball. So while I played baseball, throughout my youth and through my teenage years, that was all unaffiliated with school. And I actually ran cross country and track and field throughout the indoor and outdoor seasons, and did that up through high school, through college, and a little bit in law school as well.
Okay, great. So you were an athlete in college and you participated in cross country and track and field, which I know those are highly competitive athletes, and all these athletes I admired because I've always been a heavier set guy and running has never been my forte, but it's something I've tried to pick up. It's those obstacles in life that it's like you want to go around it, but I found it's just best to try to take them head on and just learn to be a runner and learn to exercise and all that stuff. But while you're participating in college sports, I was a collegiate athlete myself. I played baseball at 2 different schools. Were you ever aware of any of your teammates or competitors that you faced that could possibly be using any appearance or performance-enhancing substance?
I was not at the time. I was not a Division I athlete. I participated in Division III, which was a great spot for me just because you did it because you loved the sport. We were very successful, but it was something where there wasn't kind of the pressure and the kind of connection to any sort of scholarship. But that being said, it was a very competitive environment. Myself and my teammates took it very, very seriously. That was not a part of our culture within our school, and it was not anything that I had heard whispers of at the time. But, 2 things have kind of given me pause, looking back a little bit is one, the kind of the lack of testing within college sports, particularly Division III sports. There really is no way to know. Testing can be very effective as a deterrent, but also as an identifier of potential issues. But in addition to that, and this may be kind of related to my passion for anti-doping or may have had something to do with it, at the time that I was competing, particularly in college, athletes such as Marion Jones and others were at the top of the sport. And, when, Belko and, other kind of cheating scandals came to light, it really impacted me in a significant way because, these were the athletes that I followed, I rooted for. There were a number of Olympic games that they were very successful in, and I pulled for not only them personally, but for the U.S. team to be successful in track and on the field. And when that, whole, system came crumbling down, it was very disappointed and very disappointing and just a really sad day for the sport of track and field. So, given that, that sort of behavior, that conduct was going on at the time at the highest level of track and field, it would be probably a little naive to think that that wasn't going on, at least in some way at lower levels within the collegiate ranks as well.
Yeah, and always watching your favorite heroes growing up and role models, it's very disappointing when they make those sorts of decisions. So your career path, like many of ours, didn't lead to becoming a pro athlete. What got you interested in becoming a lawyer?
Well, I grew up in a household where my father ran his own law firm, and I think, in a lot of ways, that's, like you may model yourself after professional athletes that you look up to. I think a lot of, young men and women will model themselves after their parents. And, being a lawyer has a certain lifestyle, hard work, dedication, long hours, things like that. And that's what I was used to. And so, I think while there may have been considerations on my part to go into medical school or some career path like that, it just seemed that, law school was an option that I wanted to pursue and something that my family certainly supported.
Outstanding. Where did you attend law school?
I went to law school in upstate New York at the University of Buffalo. Sunny, warm Buffalo was actually a place where it was a great school for me. It was one where, because of, frankly, the inability to go outside or be comfortable outside for a good portion of the calendar year, really had me, focus on school, and for 3 years was really dedicated to doing as good a job as I could. And it was frankly right down the road where I went to college too. So upstate New York, tried and true. And then, it was something where, while it wasn't originally in the cards to move down to New York City, that is something where if you want to get into sports law or breaking into professional sports, I tell young students all the time that, being present and being physically where kind of, the decision makers are, is something that's a strong recommendation. So while it wasn't originally in the cards to move down to the city, it was something that was ultimately decided to do and was a big part of my ability to break into baseball.
And I'm glad you mentioned that on the whole law part and how getting into professional sports, you've got to work hard and it is long hours and I believe I've approached you a couple of times just because we've had students that have come forward and said, hey, I would love to get into law and I'd love to participate and be a lawyer within professional sports. And I think I've sent that information to you a couple of different times, and it's really good for those listening to hear that message that if they are interested in pursuing that legal degree and working in professional sports, that it can happen.
Yeah, it is. It is something where it is very encouraging to me that kind of hard work and dedication can, result in benefits and kind of the career path that you may have envisioned for yourself. But, I would also mention two things, and it's just a reality. There are a lot of young men and women that want to break into professional sports, whether it's baseball or football or hockey or basketball. And it is a challenging industry to break into. So, you do have to have a little bit of luck from a timing perspective and whatnot. But also, I would not be where I am today if it wasn't others for kind of, putting in a good word for me, pointing me in the right direction and assisting me, throughout particularly the early stages of my career. And that is something where, as you note, I try to pay it forward to the extent possible. I actually went back to the University of Buffalo Law School this past January and taught a class. And while I can't guarantee that, that's going to open up any career opportunities for the students that participated in my class and signed up for the class, but it is one where kind of sharing kind of my experiences with them, trying to pique their interest, and not only, professional sports, but, also anti-doping, and the things that I work on. So, it's certainly one where I appreciate all the support and the guidance and the assistance that I receive from, colleagues inside baseball and outside of baseball. And to the extent that I can provide similar opportunities for young people, that's something that I feel very strongly about.
And I have no doubt that you inspired somebody in that room, especially the career path that you've taken and the success that you've had. But it's great always to give back. And I'm sure as a student, going back many years, I just remember having teachers and professors that would come in that are in the outside world with current experience to share the work that they're doing and the path that it took to get there. It's always great to have that hands-on experience. Changing gears, it's been 15 years since the 2005 congressional hearings with Major League Baseball. Do you remember where you were during those hearings?
Yeah, I was in law school at the time, and being a big fan of baseball, but also just being incredibly fascinated with what was going on in baseball at the time, and there was actually a connection to the track and field world there too, where the players that were involved were in similar circumstances to some of the athletes in other sports, and while I wasn't following the hearings at the time as you would today, meaning through social media and otherwise, it was something where reading the newspapers, reading the media articles that were written about this and watching them on TV was something that I very distinctly recall.
I do too. And with my father being there, obviously, having a chance to watch those multiple times, it was definitely an important time. How did these hearings change Major League Baseball?
Well, I think they changed them in a variety of ways. The steroid issue, the performance-enhancing drug issue was something that was a significant challenge for baseball for a significant period of time. And while the media coverage definitely assisted and helped move the conversation forward, I don't think it was until the government and congressional intervention that really inspired the bargaining parties, and by that I mean Major League Baseball and the Players Association, to really push our anti-doping programs, our drug programs, into the direction that they needed to be. In professional baseball and all professional sports in the United States, the league office, the commissioner's office, has an obligation to negotiate with any changes that you're looking to implement that would impact the athletes or the employees job situation, job environment, and that certainly includes the drug testing programs. And for quite a few years, there was this kind of swirling topic of performance-enhancing drug use and steroid use and potential testing, and it really wasn't until those critical hearings that occurred in 2005 that really pushed both parties to go in the right direction and to work together to start that conversation of making change within the sport.
And that's a perfect transition into my next question. Can you help us better understand Major League Baseball drug testing program? Basically, from my understanding and just the general understanding, Major League Baseball's drug testing program is put together by both the Major League Baseball Commissioner's Office and the Major League Baseball's Players Association via a collective bargaining agreement. What is a collective bargaining agreement, and how does it work when it comes to drug testing?
That's a good summary, and as I mentioned before, we cannot unilaterally, as the league, as the commissioner's office, implement change with respect to things like anti-doping rules and drug testing procedures. There is something called a collective bargaining agreement, which essentially is an agreement, a contract between the representatives of the employers, which in this situation in baseball are the clubs and their owners, and the employees, which in baseball are the players that are on a major league contract and the union that represents them. And the collective bargaining agreement is essentially an all-encompassing agreement that covers all aspects of professional baseball. The economics of baseball, some of the policies and procedures and rules that govern the game. Historically, the joint drug program, and when I use the word joint, I mean jointly between the league and the union, or between the owners and the players. That joint drug program initially was an attachment to that collective bargaining agreement. So as part of the overall agreement that governs the game of baseball, the drug program was part of that. Because of the number of times that we've updated that drug agreement over the last 15 to 20 years, and just kind of the level of sophistication that program has grown into and the size of that document, it is now a separate document from the CBA. But it is still something that needs to be collectively bargained. So we take a look at that joint drug program. I think we're going to be getting into this a little bit in our conversation here, but we do take a look at our joint drug program every year versus the overall CBA, the collective bargaining agreement, which we look at every 5 years or so. But the process is essentially the same, where the union and the commissioner's office need to come together, exchange proposals, engage in discussions, and ultimately work towards reaching an agreement.
I think that's fascinating. And I don't believe many people on the outside truly understand how it works. And thank you for explaining that. Prior to the 2005 congressional hearings, were Major League Baseball players tested for drugs, whether that's recreational or performance enhancing?
There was a very brief period of time before the March 2005 hearings where the parties, and when I refer to them during our conversation here, I am again referring to the Commissioner's Office and the Players Association. We did agree to survey testing, which was essentially de-identified drug testing of all Major League players in the 2003 season, and then that resulted in some a relatively small or comparatively small number of tests being conducted throughout the 2004 season. But prior to that, there was no random testing within Major League Baseball. There was a pre-existing drug program that would cover recreational drugs that could be tested for cause. And there has been some issues within baseball throughout the 80s and 90s where that program became relevant. But again, as I mentioned before, while the parties started to come together during the 2003-2004 seasons on the topic of dealing with anabolic steroids and performance-enhancing drugs, and the possibility of rolling out random testing with a discipline component, it really wasn't until those poignant hearings where players testified, league officials participated, and folks like Don Hooton had the opportunity to speak, where it really forced the conversation into another realm and started the process of bringing the parties back together to make a more effective program from a testing perspective and a disciplinary perspective.
I'd like to make this statement. I believe, Major League Baseball has the strictest testing program in all of professional sports, and it's come a long way. What were the penalties prior to 2005 if you were caught doping?
Yeah, so dusting off the history books here a little bit. Prior to 2005, a first-time positive test for a PED, which at the time was really, the focus was on the anabolic steroids. We've become quite a bit more sophisticated since that time, and the drugs have become more sophisticated as well. But, it really was a warning initially, and then it resulted in a short suspension, 15 days, and a fine component. And then in 2005, those were increased where there was no warning anymore, and a first-time positive test resulted in a 10-day suspension, and it increased from there. And the penalties have increased pretty significantly since then, and that is really a function of the collective bargaining process. To circle back really quickly, this is the obligation that we have under federal law in the U.S. To negotiate with the players' union to get them on board and to reach an agreement on things that relate to drug testing, but also to hear their feedback and to hear their suggestions. They are the athletes that are being tested, and those are the ones that, they're the ones competing on the field, and many players have a very strong opinion on this topic, particularly nowadays. But it is one where typically, the negotiation or bargaining process is one that takes time, and I think our drug policy is a good example of that, where yes, was in 2003 to 2005, were our penalties effective? In hindsight, probably not. But it is one where you had to start somewhere. You had to start the conversation, and over time, we've been able to work together in a good faith way to get to the point now where I think our penalties are in the right place. But it was something where you're not necessarily going to go from 0 to 90 or 0 to 80, I guess, in baseball terms. But, it is one where it has improved over time, and it's been able to improve over time with the bargaining parties coming together and to share their views and to ultimately really reach a place that we can both be comfortable with.
Yeah, and having the opportunity to interact with a bunch of these players, they want more testing. They're completely on board with this, which is why I'm so glad you were able to explain the collective bargaining agreement and how that works, because these players have to agree for more testing, and they want more testing. They want the game clean. They want these drugs out of sport. So before the start of the 2014 season, the penalties for doping increases again. So you've got them. They increased from 04 to 05, and then again in 2014. And for people listening, remember, this is something both the players and Major League Baseball agree on. John, what are the penalties today in 2020 for somebody that's caught doping?
Yeah, so after those hearings in 2005, the parties came together again and increased the first-time penalty from a 10-day suspension up to a 50-day suspension. And when you consider that was a 5-fold increase, that's pretty significant. And even though those penalties were, significant at the time and comparatively to other sports were on the higher end, clearly after what we dealt with in the 2004 season, it was not a significant enough deterrent to deter players and those that support players from potentially engaging in doping. Throughout the 2014 season, we unfortunately dealt with another scandal in the drug testing PED realm. In hindsight, we refer to it as the biogenesis situation or biogenesis scandal, where an anti-aging testing clinic in Southern Florida was providing and recommending a number of performance-enhancing drugs to a large number of professional baseball players and other amateur athletes. And throughout that process, it was challenging and frustrating at times, but we were ultimately able to reach what I would view as an effective outcome, given that a large number of players were suspended without challenge, and then there was the most significant suspension in Major League Baseball history at the time imposed, high-profile athlete who did challenge, but we were ultimately successful throughout the appeal hearing that was conducted in that situation. But on the heels of that, the parties came together again and engaged in more good faith negotiations. And while we here on the league side proposed increased penalties, it was incredibly encouraging, and I can't say enough positive things about the way that our players are now approaching this topic, where they not only agreed to those significant penalties, and those were increased from a 50-game suspension up to an 80-game suspension, and for a second-time violation, it resulted in a full season of the player being out of the game. But players spoke up internally and externally to the media and otherwise, and talked about the need for more testing, the need for better regulations. And while we came to the bargaining table in that situation with some good ideas, the players came to the table with just as many good ideas, if not more. And, that really set the table for, we've had a good track record now. I mean, that was 5 or 6 years ago. But ever since that time, we've had a number of negotiations where some tweaks around the edges have needed to be made on the drug program front. We have not increased penalties since that time. And I do think we are in that sweet spot now where it is a significant enough deterrent from a first-time violation perspective where, you're going to prevent players potentially going down the road of intentional doping. But also, I think if they still do choose to do that, and after going through that significant suspension, which is for 80 games now, we don't see many, if many at all, second-time violators. So I do think we are in that right place. But in addition to those penalties, a number of other aspects of our program, from the high frequency of testing to the kind of secondary disciplinary components that we have in our program, which include not allowing players to participate in the postseason, players being barred from being elected to or selected to the All-Star game. I mean, a lot of those changes that occurred around the 2014 season were all from the player side. And again, it was incredibly encouraging to hear that. And I really have a really significant level of respect for our players group as a whole, because I know, the vast majority of them do play the game the right way and want to see a set of rules in place where we can uphold the integrity of game and deter doping to the extent possible.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And this past weekend, I was speaking at a baseball conference and had a group of young kids in the room, and we were talking about all me and doing things the right way, not just in sports, but also in life. And as these kids were taking the pledge to join the All Me League, pledging to live and compete without the use of performance-enhancing drugs, one of the kids came up afterwards and he was asking me, and I'm sure this is a very common question that you get, but when a player tests positive and they're serving their suspension, are they still receiving paychecks? Is that something you can talk about, or does their pay get voided at that point? How does that work?
Yeah, no, I will say this, as an initial response, that I can talk about most anything related to our drug program, because we take great pride in the fact that not only do I think we run an effective program, but we also run one that's completely transparent. I'll probably mention his name a number of times today, but Senator George Mitchell, at the end of the 2007 season, released his report of an independent investigation into professional baseball, which really looked historically at some of the doping-related and performance-enhancing drug-related issues that may have occurred in the past. But the most important part of that report, from my perspective, were the recommendations that he made. And many of those recommendations, if not all those recommendations, are still in effect today. But one of those recommendations was, in order to be an effective program, you need to be transparent, meaning, not, brushing anything under the rug, not having any, skeletons in the closet, if you will, and being completely open and honest about the program that you're running and the results that you're seeing. So with respect to the way that our program is structured, it's an entirely public document. And then each December, we actually publicly report all of our results. So we're the only sport that does that. And so if players are either a fan of the game, if the media is covering the game, or if someone's just looking to investigate what we're seeing in baseball, all of that is publicly known. But, a component of that is the disciplinary aspects. And, it is one where for those that are listening, particularly those young people, the penalties in baseball are very significant. I mean, the headlines are typically the suspensions. That's kind of the primary deterrent that we have, and those suspensions are without pay. So if you're being suspended for 80 games for a first-time violation, that's about half the season. And if you're making $1 million a year, if you're making, let's increase the stakes. If you're making $10 million a year, you're going to lose $5 million.
Wow.
And so you're going to not receive a paycheck during that time, and that's going to be loss of pay that you cannot get back. But in addition to that, I mean, there are secondary kind of deterrent factors that we have in play. And probably the biggest one that I hear from players is the fact that we transparently and publicly announce a suspension. So if Jon Coyles is being suspended for his positive drug test for a performance-enhancing drug, not only are we going to announce that suspension publicly, and that name is going to be forever connected to a drug testing violation, we also get very detailed with our responses, and that seems to be very effective from a deterrent perspective as well. So if I test positive for synthetic testosterone, for example, that's going to be included in the press release that we go out. And so in your local papers, in the national media, ESPN, Fox Sports, whatever the case may be, that they're going to receive that information. They're going to report on that information. And in chatting with, players over the years, that component of our discipline is sometimes the hardest pill for them to swallow, where, their wives and their parents and their girlfriends and their friends and their coaches are all going to see this and know, the details that are publicly announced. So that's one where that's a significant deterrent and something that is a very important component of our program. And then finally, in addition to that suspension, the loss of pay, and the public announcement, I briefly touched on this before, but there are a number of other things that are detriments to players as well. If they are an all-star caliber player, when they're suspended, they can't participate in the all-star game. During the season that they're suspended, even if their suspension is up, if their team makes the postseason, players are not able to participate. So if your suspension is up in July and your team makes the playoffs, even though you're back on the roster, you're then prohibited from participating in the postseason that year. And that was a player proposal because they don't want to see the postseason and the World Series impacted by someone who had a drug testing violation. And then finally, this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but there is also something in baseball called service time. Every day that you're playing as a major league player, you get a day of service, and those days will continue, grow your retirement benefits, your pension benefits, and have some other points of value. And when you're suspended, you don't get that service time anymore. And so that's a significant detriment to players as well.
Wow. Thank you for all that information. I think there's a lot of people out there that really have no concept of what happens when a player tests positive and has to serve as suspension. The other question we get all the time, Jon, I'm sure you've heard this before, and this is professional sports in general, but do you ever think in our lifetime that we'll ever see a lifetime ban for any athlete that tests positive in professional sports for a positive test?
Well, I'll never say never, but I do think given the obligations for at least professional baseball to collectively bargain with the union, that I don't anticipate that we will receive or ever be able to reach an agreement. I don't even know if we'd ever make that proposal to have a lifetime ban for a positive test. But that being said, I mean, the reason that I hesitate to say that we'd even want to go down that road is we have learned, particularly over the last decade, that while there are cases of intentional doping, and in those situations, I do feel strongly that players do need to be disciplined. I would disagree with the need to impose a lifetime ban because, one, I think the suspension, the significance of the suspensions that we have in place right now do have a rehabilitation component where, during that time, I think players re-educate themselves, maybe kind of rethink their approach. And as I previously mentioned, we don't see a lot of multiple time violators. So a first time suspension does send the right message and prevents future kind of doping violations from occurring. But in addition to that, and I know this is a topic that's near and dear to your heart, we unfortunately see, given the landscape that we operate in, there are a number of unintentional violations that can occur. And by that, I mean, performance-enhancing drugs, banned substances can enter an athlete's body through unintentional means. Now, it may be negligence that results in that or bad decision-making, but through the challenges that the dietary supplement industry promote, just the possibility of contamination in certain products that athletes may use, there is the real possibility that a player can test positive while not meaning to test positive. And for that, I would be, I would strongly urge those that may be considering a significant penalty like a lifetime ban to think twice about that, because one, I don't think anyone would want to prohibit an athlete from competing in the future or ever competing again in the future if something was unintentional. But it's also very, very difficult from a doping regulation perspective to determine whether something was unintentional or not. I think we can make a pretty educated guess, but even though our laboratories, our testing laboratories that we use and the experts that we have access to are the best in the world, it is still challenging to be 100% confident on how a positive drug test may have occurred.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up the topic of dietary supplements, because we're going to do a whole podcast with NSF Certified for Sport on that topic alone. But that's something we talk with adults, adult influencers, coaches, and young people about, is just that the dietary supplement industry is loosely regulated. And, if they're going to purchase a product, to be sure to educate themselves and to, be sure to make sure they're taking dietary supplements that are certified by NSF Certified for Sport. And that's important. And it's important for people to also understand, and we'll put another link to NSF Certified for Sport in this podcast show notes as well, but they test for over 270 banned substances. So please do not put yourself at risk of a positive test or any sort of ill health side effects simply by taking something that your friend might be taking or somebody recommended to you. Do your homework and be sure you know what you're putting into your body. How many tests are done on Major League Baseball players each year?
Well, we do a lot of testing in baseball, and fortunately we have a commissioner and leadership that provides us with the resources to do a lot of testing. Testing is a very expensive endeavor, and I think, in order to run an effective program or an effective policy, you do need to have the resources to do that, and we're very fortunate to have access to that. But, annually right now, Major League Baseball is actually conducting over 30,000 drug tests.
Oh, wow.
That doesn't just include the Major League players, even though the joint drug program is the policy that receives the most headlines and is the most kind of high profile because of the athletes that it covers. We do have 7 other drug programs in baseball that apply to minor league players, non-playing personnel, umpires, and a variety of amateur athletes. But yes, we are conducting a large volume of tests annually. We work with 2 different collection agents, CDT and Drug Free Sport International, and have relationships and send samples to 3 WADA accredited laboratories in North America, including the laboratory in Montreal, in Salt Lake, and in UCLA.
Let's shift gears for a minute, because I know another topic that's very important, not just to us, but also to Major League Baseball is education and awareness. And one of the most effective tools that we have in our arsenal is to educate people and spread awareness about the dangers of appearance and performance-enhancing substances. And most people don't realize that this is a topic that isn't being covered in the majority of our schools across the country. Since 2005, Major League Baseball has been the primary sponsor of the Taylor Hooten Foundation, which has allowed us to touch millions of lives around the world. And Jon, we can't thank you and Major League Baseball enough for your support that you guys provide us. And we know as a direct result, we're saving lives. And it's because of Major League Baseball that young people across America are getting the information that they need on this topic. What does the partnership between Major League Baseball and the Taylor Hooten Foundation mean to you and MLB?
Well, it means a great deal to me personally, and also means a significant amount or a great deal to our current and former commissioner, Commissioner Seelig and Commissioner Manfred. And I think that is shown not only by the amount of support that we've offered to the Taylor Hooten Foundation through access and other resources that we can provide, but also, as you note, the significant amount of support that we've offered and provided to the Taylor Hooten Foundation over the last 15 years. But most importantly, from my perspective, even though we try to, provide support and allow the Taylor Hooten Foundation to spread the important messages that they spread and educate as many young people as they possibly can, it's really the more important people in baseball than myself, the athletic trainers, the strength coaches, and the team physicians who have become some of the most closest allies to the Taylor Hooten Foundation over the last few years. And Professional Baseball Athletic Trainers Association and the societies of the strength coaches and the team physicians have become involved. They've provided support as well, and again, become some close allies of not only the foundation as a whole, but also entities and important entities that are supporters of the messages that you put out there. In baseball, at least in my world, our primary goal of our policies is to protect the integrity of professional baseball and the health and safety of our athletes. But to steal a line from our former commissioner, Commissioner Seelig, baseball is also a social institution. And knowing what we know, knowing that these performance and appearance enhancing substances are dangerous, and there are real risks in our society, as we talked about before, through dietary supplements, through purchase and access over the internet. We want to make sure that parents, coaches, young athletes, and fans of our game are aware of these risks. And we have found over the last 15 years that the most effective way to reach kind of the general public and those outside of professional baseball are through the initiatives that are put on by the Taylor Hooten Foundation. So, we intend to continue to support the Taylor Hooten Foundation, and it really is a, perfect fit for, the goals that not only we have, associated goals of our professional baseball drug testing programs, but just our goals and our ethics and our values on this topic generally.
Well, we can't thank you guys enough. It's allowed us to deliver hundreds of programs a year. In fact, last year we delivered over 250 programs, and I know our work together is saving lives. And outside of education, we believe that it's important to inspire young people to want to do things the right way without taking shortcuts and to live and compete without the use of appearance and performance-enhancing substances. In 2015, we formed an MLB Advisory Board with your support, which is now part of our All Me League. I'll never forget the time we ran this idea by you and other MLB staff at winter meetings, and you gave us your blessing to approach all 30 major league teams to ask that one player from each team voluntarily step forward to be a role model for our young people. And I think I even remember us having a conversation that if we could get 5 guys to help us build our board, we would have been successful. And today I'm proud to share with everybody that we have 40 Major League Baseball players who represent all 30 Major League teams. And John, I think you'd agree, these are some of the biggest names in the game. Can you share with us why MLB is so supportive of this all me messaging?
Yeah, I remember those conversations as well, Don, and to this day, I'm still impressed with your recruitment skills and your ability to take this idea into an incredible group of high profile and just, high class individuals. While I feel very strongly about, this topic and the messaging that, we're both very much in line on, our athletes themselves are the best ones to deliver that messaging and to inspire young baseball players and young fans of our game. And I can't say it enough. I find it absolutely incredibly encouraging. And not only the volume of MLB players that you've been able to recruit for this initiative, but the caliber of player. Not to say that, any player that wants to get involved in this messaging is a very good thing. But when you have the leaders of teams, when you have all-star players that are household names spreading the message of the All Me League, that's going to resonate. And that's going to be messages and kind of, guidance that the young people are going to remember. Going back in history, this topic of anabolic steroids, performance-enhancing drug use, and drug testing generally was somewhat of a contentious topic in our sport. But as we've talked about a little bit today, but as we're seeing now, the tables have really turned on that, and now we have our players not only, working hand in hand to develop and agree to a strong drug testing program that's effective, but we also have players speaking out to the media and at your programs. It is absolutely clear that the vast majority of our players want a clean game, and the All-Me League provides them a platform to support and communicate that message. And, I don't want to speak for you, but it doesn't appear that you're having a hard time recruiting guys to get on board with this. On the contrary, you may have to turn guys away just because of the need to kind of keep it a manageable group. But it's incredibly encouraging. Still is very, very exciting that you're able to establish this and continue to, utilize this group of professional ball players to communicate the message that's very important to you and I. But I also really like the fact that you don't take that lightly. During spring training and throughout each season, the fact that you thank the players for their time, you thank the players for them stepping up and really kind of give them the recognition and honor for playing the game the right way and being someone who communicates that message. It's really it's the right approach, and I commend you for the way you've gone about this.
Well, we appreciate you for all of your support, and it's great, Jon. As you know, when we're growing up, we look up to role models, and I know when we see these guys wearing their shirts and they're proud about their PSAs that we're giving, their public service ads, which we'll post in the show notes as well, we begin to get calls and we get emails, and they see these guys that are wearing these All-Me shirts. And, hey, how do I get an All-Me shirt like, my favorite player is wearing? And how do I take the pledge to join the All-Me League, to pledge to live and compete without the use of drugs? And it's always great to see. But putting your father hat on for a moment, why are positive role models important to you and other parents who might be listening?
Well, from a general perspective, I've got two young ones at home. I've seen just how adults generally, meaning parents, teachers, coaches, can impact the way, kids and other young people react, how they behave, and kind of the ethics and values that they're starting to learn. And while my kids are very young, they're currently 7 and 4, they have started asking questions about things and being curious. And while, they're still probably too young to, look up to a specific professional athlete, they do, mention adults and people that they see on TV. And if someone they look up to or model themselves after is caught up in a cheating or a doping scandal, that would be really, really hard to explain, and frankly would result in, possibly, a confused kid, confusion, sadness, But on the flip side, if someone they look up to or an athlete, if that's what we're talking about here, stands up and speaks out for things like, ethical play, values, playing by the rules, this is absolutely an effective way to educate and inspire young people, and maybe even more effective than the parents themselves. So, frankly, working hand in hand, if you can get a leader on this front, meaning someone who is a public figure that's willing to step up and speak out, and the parents and the coaches and the teachers can utilize that public figure or that high-profile individual as an example of someone to look up to and to point to, I think that's an incredibly effective way at instilling values and ethics in young people as their minds continue to grow and they start to grow up and to start to think about these important topics.
And we'll continue to interview as many of the All-Me Advisory Board members as we can. We've already released an episode with Jamison Tyon from the Pirates, retired Major League Baseball pitcher C.J. Wilson, and also Mandy Marquardt, who is a professional sprint cyclist. Jon, you've been a wealth of information and have given listeners an inside look into how anti-doping programs within Major League Baseball looks and also all of professional sports. What are your hopes for the future in anti-doping to protect our athletes?
I'll give you a couple of responses to that because it's something that I spend some time thinking about almost on a daily basis. Baseball and all professional sports are faced with a lot of challenges on the field and off the field. And while a number of topics are important, a number of topics, need to, be a priority, anti-doping and drug testing also needs to remain a priority. And we can't be sitting on our heels, as we've seen with the Russian doping scandal in the Olympic world, as we continue to see in a variety of sports where positive drug tests and other violations continue to occur. If we're going to support clean play and ethical play and the integrity of sport, we need to make sure that we remain diligent and continue to keep anti-doping front of mind and keep it as a priority. Second, we are obligated in professional baseball through the collective bargaining process, but I feel very strongly that athletes and players need to be given a voice. You cannot run a fully effective drug testing or anti-doping program without giving athletes a seat at the table. They are the ones providing samples. They are the ones that are impacted from a disciplinary perspective, but also when a athlete has a doping violation or cheats in some way, it is those athletes that they are competing against that are the most impacted. So giving them an opportunity to weigh in and to be involved in the development of your anti-doping program is something that I think is incredibly important. And finally, going forward for the future of anti-doping entities, whether it's professional sports leagues or anti-doping organizations like USADA or groups that support the anti-doping movement like our laboratories and collection agents, they absolutely need to work together. Throughout the last year or two, Don, as I'm sure you've followed and listened to, there's been a lot of anger and frustration from athletes, from different entities. A lot of that is related to some of the scandals that we're seeing in the Olympic movement. But I am a optimist to a fault, and I think that in order for anti-doping entities to be effective, we need to work together, whether it's supporting each other and making sure that people are following similar procedures to make sure that there's a level playing field at all levels of sport and throughout different sports. That's very, very important. But if entities are strapped for cash, if they are hurting from a funding perspective, if they don't, if there's new personnel involved and they're not exactly sure how to go about an issue, or if it's just sharing best practices, I think, one of my favorite things about this job is the fact that not only do I get to work with great people within baseball and in the commissioner's office, but I've also developed good, strong relationships with people who work around the world for a variety of sports leagues. We're very much aligned with USADA, as I mentioned before, and the NFL. We have created entities like the Partnership for Clean Competition, which is a coordinated effort to improve anti-doping and to invest in research to continue to get better. And I think it's that model, like the PCC, where even if you're working in different sports and even if you're required to follow different rules, if you work together, it makes everyone better. And so I think very strongly that that model should apply to other areas of sport as well.
I couldn't agree more with everything you said there, and just love to hear your passion for anti-doping to, not only keep young people safe, but also to continue to keep people aware of the health issues that are surrounded by using these types of drugs and substances. But before we wrap up, Jon, we've got a couple of curveball questions I'd like to ask you. It's something we typically do in our podcast, and these are fun questions, kind of get to know you a little bit better. First question is, what is the best piece of advice you have ever been given?
The best piece of advice I've ever been given, that is a tough one. But for the young people, I would just say generally, this is kind of a general response, but honestly, work hard and be nice to people. Can get you far in this world. I am just one that it's all about effort, right? And, while there are a lot of people out there that may be smarter than I, or smarter than me, and others that may have been, given natural talent or whatever the case may be, in the worlds of athletics or just, in the professional world, I like to think that no one will put in more time or effort than I do. And whether it's, back in the day on the track, I was not necessarily blessed with a sprinter's body, but put in the extra time in the weight room and on the track to get the most out of my body that I could. And in, the professional world, I know that, in order to be successful and to continue to be able to be lucky enough to work within professional baseball, you have to dedicate a lot of time. And that may be, a detriment to your personal life or kind of your recreational time, but I'm more than willing to do it because I love my job and I want to do a good job at it. And even in, New York City, one of the biggest cities in the world and biggest city in our country, I feel very strongly that just the simple moniker of being nice to people can get you far ahead in this world. While there may be short-term benefits if you push people out of the way or aggressively attack something, and while I'm all for going after your goals and working incredibly hard and aggressively towards that, working collaboratively and being respectful of others is something that I try to do on a daily basis and would strongly recommend anyone else that's, growing up, either trying to become a professional athlete or trying to be a lawyer or trying to work in professional sports. Those are two things where I think that can help you get ahead a little bit, and also will avoid, potential pitfalls, because if you don't work hard and you're not nice to people, that can put you in a bad spot.
You're right. There's never a substitute for hard work or being a good person. Now, if you could live anywhere in the world for a year, money doesn't matter, where would it be and why?
That is a tough one, but while I think it's all about basis of comparison, and I think I've established a pretty nice lifestyle for my family and my kids in a nice neighborhood and a nice school district, and all those things that are important to families when you're raising little ones in the midst of what seems to be a lengthy winter in the Northeast here, and the fact that we're now watching visuals of our players and our club personnel reporting to spring training in Florida and Arizona. I think you can agree that in mid-February in the Northeast, living somewhere a little bit warmer would be something that's maybe in the cards. And while I'm not exactly sure where that would be, I think myself and my family may be a little bit long overdue for a vacation. So somewhere where the temperature is above freezing and you're not looking out your window at a large pile of snow would be something that may need to be considered in the future.
So somewhere a little bit closer to the equator where you're not going to have to shovel any snow.
There you go. Absolutely.
Well, good. So my final question, and this is a really interesting one. If you could choose any two famous people, dead or alive, to have dinner with, who would they be?
Well, that is a loaded question, Don, and obviously the list is pretty significant. But since we are focused on sports and athletics here, I will pick two deceased professional athletes that I've always looked up to. I think played their respective sports in a ethical and appropriate way, and two people that were very good at their respective crafts, and two people that I would have loved the opportunity to sit with and talk to and to hopefully learn a little bit from. Since as a former track and field athlete myself, one of my favorite all-time athletes that have a picture of him on my wall, and someone that his story was always incredibly compelling to me, was Jesse Owens. Obviously a top athlete and someone who was incredibly successful on the track and one of the best in the world at the time. But his story of performing well in the Olympics, faced with a situation of racism and the challenges with Nazi Germany, and the fact that even though that was a incredibly challenging environment, he performed at a top level and was incredibly successful. But also, through kind of the person that he appeared to have been, just, ran and competed in an ethical and respectful way to his competitors. I always found that incredibly compelling. And shifting gears over to the baseball side, one athlete that I would love to have had the opportunity to speak to, just because he was one of the greatest baseball players of all time, but just someone that seemed like a very likable, nice guy who, again, kind of, played the game the right way, appeared to be, the quote-unquote strong, silent type, is Lou Gehrig. And obviously his life was cut short, but it was one where he performed at the highest level and the biggest stage, playing for the Yankees back in the earlier part of last century. But just as a young fan of the game, it was someone where I always kind of looked up to, and maybe it was his dramatic story and the fact that they made movies about him and whatnot, and again, kind of a compelling short life that kind of has resonated, and his story continues on today. I think that would be someone that would be at the top of the list as well. And interestingly, I know Mr. Gehrig and Mr. Owens kind of were competing in a similar time frame, and I think if we were sitting together, they would probably have a lot of stories to exchange with each other. So that would be an interesting conversation to look onto.
Yeah, I'd like to be a fly on the wall for that conversation. But Jon, thank you so much for all your time. I know you're a busy guy, and we can't thank you enough for your support and the support for Major League Baseball. because of you guys and because of our partnership. Over 2 million lives have heard Taylor's story. We have so much more work to do, but I know we're saving lives. So thank you guys for your support. Visit our website, all of our social media, the All Me League, and our podcast to get more information and awareness. But Jon Coyles, thank you again for your time today. We appreciate you, and we appreciate you sharing all of your knowledge with us during this podcast.
Absolutely, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.